Welcome to a casual chat with Rupert August, featuring
Henry.
Kurtz.
Hi, man.
There we go. Job done. Alright, what are we talking about today, boys?
Let's go, boys.
Well, you said to look over the last podcast, and it sounds like I'm the only one who has any ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I brought enough ideas to the table last time. It's someone else's turn to pick up the slack.
That's fair.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, Simon, do you want to jump into it?
Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Do you have ideas?
So, okay, it's my show now, is it?
Start us off.
Okay. Oh god, I probably should have formatted this better.
Okay, so before you start, I guess a fair warning to the viewers. This will be probably a bit more rambly, and it go off on a lot more tangents.
Emphasis on casual chat.
Emphasis on casual and emphasis on the fact that this is not remotely structured.
Oh, yeah. If you couldn't tell.
Anyway, to kind of maybe as a jumping off point from a previous podcast is, for me, I thought we'd talk about maybe just the general responsibility of the individual, because despite me doing the whole arm wavy denial of, you know, it's like someone who's in the closet kind of thing, where he's like, oh yeah, guys, I'm totally not gay, and then I'm here being like, I'm totally a libertarian, honest, and it's like, probably not.
Well, you can still be a libertarian and believe in some measure of personal responsibility, but in fact, if you go by a lot of people's definitions, especially classical definitions, then that's the only real way to do it without breaking down the whole system. But we'll get to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I suppose I just know that for the one libertarian that might see this, they're going to go, oh, what a fucking traitor Simon is.
Mm-hmm.
Quite possibly.
Isn't the whole point of libertarianism that people are responsible for themselves, at least? Otherwise, the whole society would just break down.
Yeah, actually, it is. I'm just being a bit facetious on that front. Anyway, sorry, tangenting. I wanted to talk about the responsibility of the individual, and kind of like how far that responsibility goes. So, how far an individual needs to be politically aware around him, and in that case, should we lower the barrier to entry to being political? Can we make it more accessible? Should it be made more accessible in the first place?
Right.
I think that would be a good part to start, because otherwise me literally saying the responsibility of the individual will be here for like 10 hours.
Well, okay, so should we borrow the structure from a previous podcast then, and think about what are the current responsibilities of the individual voter? I assume you're talking.
Yeah, let's talk about just the average everyday person.
So what are the responsibilities, and what do we think they should be? Does that sound good?
Sure.
Who wants to start? I guess I will. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think in terms of voting, if you'll forgive me for taking it in that direction, I think there is a responsibility to, I suppose, be at least minutely aware of what policies are, which is effort. As people probably already know, it is effort reading through all the manifestos and looking at all the news coverage to find out what people actually believe and what their viewpoints are. Which I don't know. I think is the main one, and I can't really think of much else that you really need to do other than to avoid getting judged by your nan or something.
Well, there is a lot of social stigma associated with voting without being sufficiently, engaged in the political system, knowing how it all works and knowing what policies you're actually voting on.
Is there though?
Well, there is, because the idea of being an uninformed voter is generally a slur, and like you might be called stupid or something if you're only engaging with things on such a surface level.
I mean, we've all seen videos of people walking around parks and public gatherings and marches asking people what they think of whatever politician, whatever party's position, and they just do not know what they're talking about, and they've basically just got a video that's based around just laughing at people for being so stupid, so uninformed, going and supporting something they don't truly understand. So There's certainly a stigma around being uninformed.
So those would be some of the costs with in relation to the individual rather. But there's a wider consequence as well, because that justification is often used to try and delegitimize certain political outcomes, particularly when it comes to something like the Brexit referendum, where there have subsequently been quite a few calls to, hold another referendum on the basis of like improper information or, insufficiently educated voters and all that kind of thing.
And we've effectively had the vote 3 times now, so...
Well, yeah, in a certain sense, but that's been packaged with a whole bunch of other things, like which party's going to be in government and all that kind of thing. Even if they tried to hold it up, hold up their campaign with essentially just Brexit and saying, we'll get Brexit done, inevitably there's going to be other policies that come along with that, which is going to divert some amount of the vote.
Yeah, I will say, just to preface the example I just gave, that it is all too easy to... Just because someone's uninformed and has voted for a particular party doesn't mean everyone that votes for that party is uninformed. It's all too easy for a media outlet to go out, ask 100 people, and only air the 5 stupidest they found that day in order to push a narrative.
Any scientific study that only uses 100 subjects is immediately laughed out of the academic room, so using a sample size of 100 people for anything is just not adequate.
Well, that's not exactly the business that the media's in, though, right?
No, but that's just kind of my point, is that even under the scientific method, that many people is not enough to get a fair gauge of what a potential majority thinks of.
Yeah.
So at the moment the responsibility that we've said is everyone should vote and should be informed. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily say everyone should vote. I mean, voting is based on the idea that you are informed and opinionated on the matter. Voter turnout is usually pretty low in most places that don't make it mandatory. And I think making voting mandatory is you're just encouraging uninformed people to vote in that case, which only exacerbates the situation, I think.
Yeah.
So you're saying that current responsibility then is not only voting and making sure you're informed, if you're not informed, you should choose not to vote.
Yes.
Ideally, but that's probably not going to happen because it's such a costless action to actually go out and put the poll card in the or not the poll card, but like put the slip in the ballot box. That all of the stuff that should go into it, that takes up more of the time, can be safely disregarded by whoever's casting the vote.
Yeah, but we're talking about...
But that vote is still going to amount to the same as the most, well-read voter around.
Yeah, but, we're trying to just get, like, a baseline of what we'd say is... Would we say that's, like, what is currently expected, or just what we'd expect at the moment in the current state of things?
I suppose what we'd expect. It's hard to say what is currently expected by everyone. So, yeah. So, earlier, it sounds weird to say earlier, we said, uninformed voting is frowned upon. And it is to a certain extent, but the thing that I would say is that it depends who you are. If you say, okay, I voted Conservative, you better be prepared to have a proper reason to say you voted Conservative. If you were saying, I voted Green, I don't think people seem to question it. They just say, okay, you must care about climate change.
I feel like that depends on the circles you hang around with. I mean, in this group, if one of us came together and went, hey, I voted Conservatives, the other 3 would be like, well, of course you did. If one of us had said that we had voted Green, then it would be a much different reaction.
Probably involving pitchforks and torches.
And possibly that, yeah.
I mean, not to tip our hand or anything.
Oh no, we're very neutral on all matters.
Of course. As any talking head / media outlet should be, right?
Ah, yes.
Perfectly neutral.
We're as neutral and unopinionated as any media outlet.
You guys were present for that last podcast, right?
Mentally, no. Anyway, moving on.
So that's voting responsibility. I guess now we have to go to the fun and nebulous topic of community and society responsibility, which is kind of set out in laws, because obviously if you break the law, you're technically violating the sort of like social contract, and you're theoretically only temporarily taken out of society until you've learned better. Assuming, you're not literally in prison for life, obviously.
Well, again, going with the what is the current responsibility? I suppose your responsibility is fairly minimal. In terms of, okay, you if you don't look after yourself, go on benefits. You don't look after your body, you get the NHS. At least in this country.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, and there really isn't much other than obey the law. I mean, it's even permissible for you to be dismantling parts of current society. Actually, no, that would be one thing that you're not supposed to do, is that you're not supposed to challenge sort of socially accepted dogmas. So as long as you play broadly with the the accepted current liberal paradigm, and you don't break laws, then you're fine. But even that varies from community to community.
Does anyone have any verdicts on how we should act then?
I suppose I should go first, talking about individualism then. I suppose that your duty to yourself would be... Well, I suppose I'm going to come at this from the point of view as an Ayn Randian again. So I would say just simply to look out for yourself and those close to you. To put it in its simplest terms.
I'd maybe expand on that and say maybe to be a bit aware of what's going on in your local community.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and then in the context of voting, to be aware of what's going on politically, socially around you. Be aware of the hot button issues of the day. So
I personally, at least on the voting end, I don't agree. I don't really prescribe to the line of thought that everyone in a democracy should be voting and everyone should be an informed voter. I think the people that are voting should probably be informed, but I don't think it should be a responsibility to vote. I think that if you just don't care, that's your choice, and that you shouldn't be even socially obliged to vote.
I mean, okay. I think we.
Yeah, I suppose I agree with that.
I also think we can all agree that mandatory voting does not sound like the best idea.
No, it dilutes the informed perspectives in there. But an informed perspective is not necessarily someone who actually has expertise. It's somebody who just cares a lot about an issue. So you just get ruled by activism.
Yes, the wedge issue politics.
Yeah. But probably an even more extreme version if we're not even going to be socially pressuring people into voting.
Yeah.
And you, of course, also introduce the spectre of vote farming, essentially, where you can just entice people or certain groups with, material gains in order to vote for you. And the only way to avert that would be to, increase the amount of voters to kind of drown out that effect. And if you add the social expectation that people vote, then they're not going to be as willing to throw their vote away. The only way I see that you could get around this issue is if you add some kind of additional cost to voting.
It's starting to sound like only landowners can vote kind of deal.
Yeah. Yeah, it sure is, isn't it?
All right, Captain Starkey. So assume we're kind of happy with that, with what our expectations are.
To an extent, I think for me it depends too much on what the systems are that are taking place around all of this. So, for example, if we're going to be assuming that we're going to continue to live in a somewhat democratic community, then that probably changes the answer slightly, because there is a personal responsibility probably to be politically engaged and not be exploited by the system if you are going to be working in a democratic system. Whereas if you don't hold that to be true, or sacred rather, then you can safely dispense with that, and it doesn't matter if people are politically engaged anymore.
Right. Can we maybe put a pin in that, and we can talk about systems beyond democracy after we've finished talking about the responsibility of society?
Yeah, sure.
So, responsibility of society, like, I assume we're talking what society owes the people within it and what the people within it owe society, or have we kind of already covered that? We just...
So I've actually written some poetry about this issue, interestingly. Plug.
Look at Rupert's poetry, damn it.
Yeah, so basically the way that I conceptualize this in a wider social context is that the aristocracy, so perhaps not the community per se, but the upper echelons of the community have a duty of care to a certain extent towards the people below them. And in return, the people, everyone else basically, they have a duty of not tearing down the system and not getting overly jealous about the fact that there are haves and have-nots, haves and have-nots, rather. But I think that will probably come natural if you have a kind of caring aristocracy which is willing to take the hits first in the event of some kind of crisis, as a way of returning the favour for the fact that when times are good, they get a disproportionate slice of the pie. I guess think about Japan, because that's something that we don't quite understand, and we don't get it in the same way over here in the West that they do over in Japan, where you have executives willing to take pay cuts quite readily and things like that in hard times in order to maintain their employee base as is.
Yeah, it's very funny that Japan gets a lot of praise for its supposed from certain actions it takes that appear relatively progressive, when in actuality Japan is incredibly hierarchical.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Patriarchal, probably you could even say.
Yeah, definitely. So because they even have honorifics that refer to to someone who is their senior, even if it's only by a couple of years, or even a senior in the sense of they've worked at a job longer than they have. And it's usually, the senior is usually given a lot of respect, but then that respect comes at the cost of that they must look after their junior.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what word I said earlier, because I've got a feeling it was patriarchal, but I meant to say paternal. But yeah, very, very paternal kind of viewpoint, where the aristocracy feels like it's got to protect the people who are below it. I mean, well, yeah, just go back to the idea of them having a personal duty. But in response, the everyone below them owes loyalty and kind of service.
Yeah. So,
go on.
So when we're talking about what is the overall responsibility of society, is that our expectation. Well, our expectation is that those nearer what you'd call the upper rungs should safeguard those in the lower rungs, and those who are below them should be caring. Is that kind of the expectation we expect in society?
Yeah, pretty much, I would say. Those below should respect the authority of the above, and those above should protect those below.
Kurt, Henry, any input?
Yeah, I'd say I agree with that.
That's quite interesting, actually, because it's almost like anti-individualistic and pretty anti-Randian, really.
Yeah, I know. It's one of those things where, once again, I appear to be a massive hypocrite. Because while I am not all about, but I'm massively in favour of this idea of personal struggle and individuals being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak. There is certainly a sense that society needs to function as a society. You can't look at everything completely selfishly. Some people those people who manage to reach the top should have a duty to protect those below them.
Which relies on a system where they reach the top because of help from those above. And that they're doing that because they're, I suppose, repeating the system or paying back into the system that helped them?
Not necessarily. So, the idea of noblesse oblige, although it would be a mistake to say that there was no possibility of, kind of lower level people or lower station people being able to move up in the world into the aristocracy, it was certainly a lot less the case than it is now, as far as I know anyway. But I would actually go further to say that that's probably a feature of kind of hereditary systems, because the people inhabiting those positions do not get to tell themselves that they are there purely because of their own qualities and their own merit. Therefore, necessarily you would have to have a stake in the society at large, because the society at large has given you your position. I think that encourages very much of a more pro-social kind of perspective, and I think that's valuable and something that's very much been lost with our race towards a kind of financial meritocracy.
It probably doesn't help that, as you say, in our rush to financial meritocracy is when a lot of jealousy comes out, and that's where those who should... It's one of these things where you don't know which came... I don't know which came first, which is somewhere along the lines, either those at the top really just stopped caring, or those at the bottom really started being disrespectful. And one is led into the other, where if people at the bottom have stopped being respectful, literally saying millionaires and billionaires don't deserve the money they earned when a good majority of them did, then they feel like they're not being respected. So why would they look after some people who are not remotely grateful?
Yeah. Well, you could... I mean, there's a few other things that I think go into that, the resentment. I think a big one of them is probably the egalitarianism that has pervaded modern thought for quite a while. Because when you start at the base assumption that everybody is, fundamentally equal or fundamentally not that different from one another, then it becomes a question of, okay, how lucky and how much work could one person possibly do over everyone else? And that doesn't equate to the literally, billions of times of wealth outcome that you see at the end. So people start thinking, okay, there's no possible way that another person could be, millions of times more productive than everyone else. But I think that results from starting from the wrong base assumptions, because, if you assume that there are people who are, so incredibly more competent than everybody else that they can generate such immense amounts of wealth just by working even a little bit in relation to everyone else, then suddenly it makes a lot more sense when you combine that with the traits of hardworking, having a hardworking nature, being quite diligent, and also having a bit of luck along the way. And then, of course, you get into other factors like government interference in the market, which they can harness for their own purposes and make a lot of money that way. Then yeah, it starts to make a hell of a lot of sense as to how you can have billionaires, multi-billionaires, and so many millionaires, etc., etc., etc.
Sorry, I've just been a little quiet trying to reconcile my whole objectivism with the idea of duty above and duty below sort of thing that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, there probably is an objectivist argument that you could make to do with...
I mean, a lot of the things that you were saying just then were actually making me think, like, that's kind of sort of ticking some objectivist boxes. You didn't use the phrase just then, but it was very much sort of... I felt as if you were almost going to use it, or if I was in your place, I would have used the phrase "great man."
Oh yeah,
yeah, to describe that person who's just a little bit more diligent, or it was just through sheer force of will or personal motivation has managed to propel themselves further than other people.
Yeah, well, you could look at it. You can look at it in terms of a Pareto distribution, which is typically the way that I'm looking at it. In that, you take somebody who has, the top 20% of competency in, I don't know, let's say they have they're in the top 20% of people for IQ. And they also have the qualities of being generally hardworking in a personality sense. And they also get lucky along the way. Partially just due to the fact that they've put themselves in the position to, for that luck to make the difference, but luck is definitely a part of this kind of thing. And then once they've started to get a little bit of momentum, they can start using things like personal connections. So one thing that some people have pointed out that makes a lot of difference is just where you're born and where you grew up. And this is part of the whole thing as well, with people just deciding that they want to make it, so they go and move to Silicon Valley. Like, you need a geographical proximity as well in order to interact with all of these other things and allow you to propel yourself to become, incredibly powerful and wealthy and such. But yes, there certainly is a factor of great man theory coming into this.
Let the great men excel.
But then the problem there is that if you do just let the great men excel, and then you add in the idea that anybody can make it if they just work hard, which is basically the angle that we come at it from, the angle that current society comes at it from, then you get a whole lot of people resentful of the fact that they've worked really hard.
You get people who are resentful who've worked very hard and didn't make it, which is, I think, a lot of people can just accept as a fact of life. But then you've also got the people who did make it. If they are also coming from the same angle, then they lack sympathy because they're like, well, I made it, you're clearly just not working hard enough.
Well, yes, this is the problem that I'm raising attention to. I mean, you can look at it... let's get a little bit more controversial then, because if you look at it from the perspective of, okay, well, government's done almost nothing for me, all my success has been my own, why should I pay taxes?
Well, taxation is theft, but I'm kidding, but yeah, I get what you mean there. Anyone else got any thoughts on that?
I suppose you're sort of relying on those people who have made it, those millionaires and billionaires, to have the awareness that the government has provided them with a framework to be successful in.
I think that's the point, though, is that if you, or I suppose if your societal view is that these people are self-made men and that no one's really helped them, they've done it all themselves, rather than highlighting the fact that, yes, they've used all these... I mean, even if you keep it in the people aspect, you've used all of your employees who have worked very hard for you. You've not got it yourself. It's a societal outlook that doesn't lend itself to...
pro-social behaviour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think part of the issue, to go back to the social outlook, is also the fact that people get this idea in their heads that to make it is to somehow be part of that millionaire billionaire class, when not everyone is geared that way. There are sometimes making it is literally just being like, hey, I have a nice job and I can go to the pub every weekend. I'm quite happy with how my life is.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back a bit even further then, because probably even more fundamental than that is all of this stuff is going to be completely irrelevant if you neglect your personal responsibility of having children. Like, it's going to be completely irrelevant in 100 and 150 years time how much money you made, basically, if you have no genetic footprint anymore.
I had a feeling we'd get to this part, which is familiar responsibility, I suppose would be the term.
Yeah. That's probably where things probably where things get even more interesting, to be honest.
Mm.
If only just because I've been seeing a lot of things about this recently, particularly in regards to the amount of people who were drafted into, or just generally absent from the household in World War II, goes some way towards potentially explaining what came afterwards, because you have a generation of people who, well, at least a significant percentage of a generation of people who didn't really have a father in the household, and therefore, perhaps you start seeing some of the same things that are associated with that in the modern day. Except, the way that we record it is different, because they did have fathers, it's just that those fathers weren't present. And then, even when those fathers were present afterwards, they may not have been present entirely, psychologically, because of the way that the war had troubled them and things.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And I think it goes away to explaining something that I've certainly, well, I think we've talked about it before, actually. So it's something that we've certainly noticed, in that there's a certain lack of community in the sort of modern era. And the reason I say it's partially linked is because what we've discussed before is it's usually the women who didn't have to work that were the pillars of the community and organising events and things like that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That I suppose your society is based around, and seeing as now that most of the women at work, and we've lost that. I don't know.
I mean, sorry. So the part of the issue, and as well, is that while some, as you say, women are working rather than staying home, it's also unfortunately, due to the situation, just general world situation over the last decade or so, women have had to work because one person bringing in a salary is just not enough to support a family.
Mm.
Well, that's partially just due to workforce saturation, though, because one person's wages would have gone a lot further, or would go a lot further generally if there was a bit more, wage inflation, let's say.
So to maybe round this out into more of a question, what do people think of the responsibility of that? If society, obviously to keep society going, you must have children. So what do people think of the idea of the responsibility of you must procreate?
I think it's a good societal responsibility. I think wording it as you must procreate sounds a bit dodgy.
Just gun to your head, you must procreate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, based on my view of history, which is quite demographically focused, I suppose, you can make a trade-off, or you can discuss it in terms of a trade-off, in that if you want to live in a more significant or wealthy or generally powerful place going forwards, then you have to have children. Otherwise, one of two things is going to happen either way. Either you're going to be very quickly disavowed of that expectation, or you're going to be piggybacking on all of the other people who do that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can have people who are contributing in other ways, and for example, let's say you're an uncle, and you don't want to have children yourself, but you make a lot of effort to improve the upbringing of your nephews and nieces and such. That can work.
What's the old phrase of "it takes a village." Yeah.
But again, that requires a very pro-social viewpoint on part of society and the people who are making all of these decisions.
I mean, in regards to having children and it being a social responsibility, I would also add that the best way to continue your culture is to have children. So if you want your culture to continue and to last, you need to keep on having children, and they need to have children. Otherwise, your cultural values will just disappear with no one to carry them on.
I mean, the cultural values will naturally start to drift anyway, but it's a way of making sure that the culture itself is in all its forms is preserved, I assume.
Well, yeah, let's give the devil his due, because there is a certain extent to which you could try to get other, the children of other nations, essentially, to believe in your ideas and carry your culture forward. But not only is that a lot more of a tenuous prospect, because it's a very risky strategy for really not very good reasons. What is it that you don't personally want to go through the trouble of changing nappies? I don't know. It doesn't seem like a very good reason to me. But let's say it's purely for economic reasons, to make a slightly stronger argument, I suppose. And that you have a very high-paying job, you're a CEO or whatever, and you don't want to have children because that would require you to take however many hours off your week in order to help raise the child. Well, you're kind of relying on colonizing the brains of a whole bunch of other people to carry on your culture for you, which presumably you think is superior, because otherwise you would logically start changing you'd start changing your practices, probably. So, I don't know. Does anyone else want to build on this? Hopefully you can see where I'm going.
So, go ahead, Henry. Sorry.
No, you first. I was just going to ask. I suppose I will go first, but it's just because I wanted to ask a quick question. So you believe that CEOs believe they're superior because of the practices that they currently employ? What exactly do you mean?
Oh, okay. So no, I'm talking strictly about, let's say, Western values, or belief in.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, belief in like diversity and equality and tolerance and all that kind of thing. Presumably, you think those are virtues. Therefore, what you would be hoping to do is to carry those on in the minds of other people. So, okay, you're going to colonize their brains. You're going to erase their culture, replace it with your culture. Then, question mark? Like, okay.
I mean, you make it sound like it's kind of like almost like a mentoring thing, but then the whole idea of, like you said, colonizing another country's brains of its people, or of its children specifically, and erasing their culture and placing it with your own that's just an uncomfortable prospect in every single way. Like, I feel like that's really hitting a moral area I do not like.
Well, I'm wording it deliberately, provocatively, obviously, but I mean that's kind of what it's coming down to. But I think we can see from the experience of a lot of diaspora cultures that doesn't necessarily hold. And even if you can get the first generation, presumably they came to your country because they like something about it. Maybe that's the culture. Maybe that's some of the ideas. Maybe it's just for money. But I feel like a lot of the diasporas that are here in Britain, say, are here in the first instance because they thought it represented something that they wanted to be closer to. But then what happens in subsequent generations is that it seems that quite a few of them drift away and kind of go back to where they came from.
I don't know. I feel like I'm struggling to put myself in that mindset just because it is something that I disagree with. So, I don't know. I suppose so wholeheartedly. I'm sure Rupert's going to pick me apart on something I've said at some point.
Wait, what do you mean? You disagree with what I'm saying?
No, as in terms of the idea of this, CEO just out to make money, importing workers from other foreign countries.
Well, that's just an individualized version of what we're kind of wired doing as a society. In that, oh yeah, I don't want to have children because it's not right for me economically. I want to get myself a bit more stable first. In combination with, oh yeah, of course we need more immigrants because we need to, pay for all of the various services and such.
I suppose the logic there is that there is there is work that needs to be done now, and there's a lot of complaint, or a lot of the more relevant example recently is things like strawberries or just fruit in general that needs picking, and so we import Romanians to do it.
Sure, but a lot of that changes in relation to the various different factors that go into, for example, remuneration for that work. So if you increase the wages, then you can take the labour from other sectors of the economy who can't bid as much and thus aren't doing something that is as significant to the economy, because otherwise they'd be willing to pay more for that service. But this is also coming at a time when a lot of people are, there's a huge amount of slack in the labour market. A lot of people are at home right now, not working. Therefore, I call bullshit on that.
Sorry, this is something that's going to seem a little off topic, but I really want to ask it before we move too far away from it.
Okay.
And it's a question for you specifically, Rupert. You keep on. You've obviously you're the one who first used the phrase in this conversation of it being a social responsibility to have children, and you just used the example of people putting off having children in order to become more financially stable or for whatever reason. So, what's your opinion on this idea of people who are not fit to be parents becoming parents? Because what if there is a genuine situation where people just are not financially stable and they just have children anyway, and they have too many kids that they can't support, and then they become a burden on the state and they can't raise them properly, so they grow up with shitty values? I feel there's a line here, and I'm just wondering where you draw it.
Okay, so I could split that up into two different things. So for one thing, in terms of preparedness, do you mean more mental preparedness in terms of people feeling as though they're prepared to have children, or do you mean preparedness in kind of more materialistic terms of someone who could come from outside and say, okay, this couple is clearly not equipped to have children right now? What do you mean?
I mean both. Someone who is able to, who is themselves mentally sound enough to raise a child and have it not and have them turn out to be a normal, functional human who won't just grow up with an ass ton of complexes, and also who is able to support them financially.
Okay, so in terms of mental preparedness, I think nature does a pretty good job of that by pumping all the right chemicals into you to, make you essentially more mature in the wake of having a child. That's something that I've seen a few different people report, actually. That's anecdotal evidence, of course, but I feel like because if you go back in history to almost any degree, then you find a situation where there is no contraception and people are getting pregnant a lot earlier with a lot less material available, like information available to actually help them through the process and help them through the process of actually raising children. And they did it pretty much fine. Therefore, we're probably over-analyzing it to draw that up as a question mark. I think people probably think in too explicit a manner now, whereas in the past there had been a kind of certain tacit understandings, and that even when a child came along and it wasn't necessarily expected, people just kind of got on with it, and it worked out broadly all right. Because especially if you think about, for example, the generation who grew up to become the kind of 1914, fighting age males types. Or even go a little bit earlier and you say the Victorian types. Those are pretty much some of the most prime Western specimens, European specimens that were ever produced. And they were doing so without the internet, without widespread contraception. People weren't exactly choosing to have children then, per se. It was just a case of, a series of natural urges which lead them towards the right conclusions. Therefore, we're probably overanalyzing it, I would say. In response to the other part of that, I think it would be helpful if the state would help people out in regards to having children. Because if you're thinking, okay, maybe I'm not necessarily financially stable enough to have a child, it's going to cost this much going forward, then you're exactly the kind of person who needs to have the child because you are exercising quite a lot of forethought, which we would like to preserve in a genetic context, as well as obviously a social context, because you'll probably be able to pass that on quite efficiently to your offspring through, education or whatever as well. So it's almost like a catch-22 kind of situation where the kind of people who are not going to think about that are, as you perhaps correctly state, although I think there's a little bit of room for nuance there in that, there's a certain amount of variance when it comes to new children on the genetic level. So there's going to be a certain amount of variance from the parents. But yeah, in general, the people who are not expressing the kind of forethought that makes them question whether or not it's going to be good for them to have a child in financial terms going forward for the next, anywhere up to 20 years. Yeah, those people are going to have the children anyway, so you need to be able to balance that out with people who are able to function more effectively and more rationally in society.
Maybe add to this, or to add another perspective that I don't think people overly think about, and that is, speaking as someone who is a relatively indecisive man at the best of times, people are very good at coming up with excuses for why they shouldn't do something. And so the whole, maybe I'm not mature enough for a child, maybe I'm not financially well off for a child, sometimes it can be just a means to excuse themselves from the process of child raising, because they don't want to, they have personal doubts. They don't really want to do it, and it's a lot of responsibility. Even though people who might not be financially well off enough to have children will somehow figure it out. They will manage. That seems to be more the case than isn't.
Yeah, especially when it's a socially rewarded perspective to have. That, you're doing a good thing for the environment, for example. Even though, of course, there is no difference between an imported body in the West versus a native-grown body in the West in terms of the carbon footprint.
So before we do move on too much, I think there is another factor which we touched on earlier, where it takes a village. There should be a societal structure around people, and I feel like if you do just end up in the situation where you have a child and you don't know what to do, you will form a societal structure around you. You will form a community of people that help, even if you don't have that government aspect, although it is nice. If your parents are still alive, you go ask your parents for help. If your friends are around, they'll be willing to help, and if not, then you work harder.
Well, that and most people have their... I'm probably speaking very anecdotally, because obviously different areas and things like that, but in my area, literally just today, a neighbour from up the road knocked on my door and said, hey, do you want to hang out this Friday and sit on our driveway and get a chair and have some sandwiches and some beer? And so there is definitely even like a local community aspect where at the end of the day, even your neighbours would probably want to help in some form if they can.
Yeah.
And it's relevant, but it's quick. So my dad said something to me the other day where it was a fairly offhanded reference, where we were talking about just having kids in general, and he said, you will always struggle with money. Doesn't matter how much you prepare. You'll either spend too much or you won't have enough. You'll just find that the expenses add up. You live within your means. At least in his experience, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's generally a recorded phenomenon. That expenses will often expand to accommodate for the income that's being generated.
Yeah, so to anyone listening to this podcast and being like, "Oh, I'm not ready to have children," it's like, well, the best time to have children was yesterday, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone, go out, have a child. Doesn't matter how old you are or who it's with. Just do it now.
Well, I mean,
slow down.
They're already gone. They're already gone. It doesn't matter what you say now.
Okay, well, let's break that down a little bit more then. Actually, no. Before we do, do you have any thoughts on my? So you initially asked me those dual questions, Kurtz. What did you? Do you have any response? Any thoughts?
I do appreciate where you're coming from on both of those. I do understand, especially the financial one. The person who's thinking, "Oh, am I ready for this financially?" is clearly already financially minded, and they're going to make the right decisions. I just can't help but, and seeing as we're all using anecdotal evidence today, I just can't help but think everyone at school knew one of those kids who had 6 or 7 siblings, and not one of them was well mannered, and not one of them had an intact jumper or pair of trousers, and it was clear that that family was just shitting out children that were just. I'm trying to use words here that aren't going to make me sound like an elitist piece of shit. But these people who are starting off with a bad hand and will inevitably play it poorly due to not being raised well.
Sure. But, I mean, if you wanted to be entirely, I guess, brutal about it, who's going to be the one that's going to inherit the planet in future generations? It's going to be exactly those kind of people, because they're actually having enough children, rather than the people who wait to give their child the perfect upbringing and consequently don't have children until they're in their 40s.
Yes, we've all seen Idiocracy.
Well, I haven't actually, but...
Oh, wow. You probably wouldn't enjoy it, but...
Yeah, I'm sure.
I can feel the national IQ going down right now. I'm sorry about that, Henry. Go on.
No, I was just going to say I don't agree with that argument Kurtz just made. I mean, there were plenty of people that were, even single children who were either spoiled rotten or just absolute dickheads anyway. I think you'll get bad parents and good parents, and it's difficult to know which one you are until they're grown up, really. Kids are going to be kids.
Should we move on to...
Well, no, actually, there was an additional point that I was going to make, which is that, of course, you can look at this in more of a stratified manner. Of course, I'm going to do that. I take a lot of my thought from the Italian elitist school. So, ideally, you want to be... You should have, in a perfect scenario, just to hedge out genetic possibilities, because I'm no geneticist, therefore it would probably be most prudent to say that it's 50-50, environment and genetics. Therefore, just to kind of maximize your chances of getting a highly capable and competent population, you would want the people at the highest end of your society having the most amount of children. Suffice to say, that is not happening right now. I dare say that in a lot of cases it hasn't been happening since the Victorian era, probably.
I'd say you're talking a couple centuries there, mate.
Yeah. And I would say that the anti-Flynn effect has, as far as I know, been in effect for quite some time. It's just that we've been able to hedge it out by improving the quality of life of, pretty much everyone within the realms of, basically making sure that the children who are brought up are going to be brought up in situations that aren't going to diminish their potential to the greatest possible extent. In physical terms, of course. So, things like diet, cutting out malnutrition. I don't know how much of an effect schooling has, honestly, but if it does, then that's obviously improved to a certain extent since a couple of centuries ago. But those genetic factors are going to be diminished over time if, we keep on with current trends. So I guess you could add to the aristocratic responsibilities to bring this all back, that it is an aristocrat's responsibility to have basically as many children as they can reasonably handle, in terms of being able to give them a good life and upbringing and such.
Okay, so that's something new to talk about then. I was thinking we could move on, but now that you've brought that up, would you say then that maybe if we talk about this idea of a more hierarchical society of people at the top, people at the bottom, would you say then that maybe the responsibility of having children would be more geared for those near the top of society rather than those at the bottom?
To me, the advantage of being lower in the social hierarchy would be increased liberty. So the higher up you go, the more responsibility you take on, the more duties you have, and if you fail to meet those duties, the more social pressure there'll be, and the more maybe even physical repercussions in some way. Whether that be some kind of social ostracization or something. if somebody's failing to kind of meet those requirements and doesn't have an adequate reason for it. But the further down you go, the less is going to be expected of you, other than, don't undermine society fundamentally. But other than that, if you want to, spend your days whoring, drinking, going to work, repeat, then yeah, whatever.
Anyone else got anything to add? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I agree with that. Basically, yeah. I know that's not an interesting answer, but
well,
man raises a good point.
Henry, what do you think?
You got anything? Sorry, Rupert, I keep talking over you.
That's all right. We both got the same impulse for when to chime in.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't know if I would split it up as much as you seem to be. So I think the way that I tend to think is in terms of a local community.
Okay.
And I suppose it does make sense for the aristocracy to have as many children as they possibly can, but it also makes sense for those on the lowest rung to have as many children as they possibly can. Because yes, it's investment, but it does. I mean, if you're going back a couple of centuries, it's more hands to put to work.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what we're currently describing is basically how populations have, an explosion onto the world stage. Because in order to do that, you need a lot of people who are going to be able to go to frontiers and do all the hard work. And, people who are going to fill out the ranks of the armies and all that kind of thing. So between these two impulses. But, okay, I guess the distinction to be made is that the social expectation exists more in the aristocracy, because at least when your population is undergoing a certain, contraction or a stagnation, a slow period, if you're at least improving your population over that time through, genetic factors, then you can be preparing yourself more so in future for the potential explosion that you'll be able to enjoy by having the people's, the general populace's capabilities improved. So, let's say the people, there's not enough food to go around, so only the people who are, really wealthy can afford enough food to sustain a big family, and the people at the lower end can literally just about feed themselves and two children, say. Once that food situation improves, if over that time you've been able to, improve the quality of your population through genetic means, then you are going to be much more equipped to, explode onto the world stage again once those food prices drop, and allows the people at the bottom to have, 4 or 5 children. Because you're very rarely going to be able to do that with, aristocrats alone. But if you improve the quality of the population overall, and suddenly the people towards the lower end are equivalent to yesteryear's aristocrats in terms of capability, plus whatever technological advances they've been or whatever, then you're going to be in a much better place to compete.
But as we were saying earlier, people don't tend to choose to have children. At least not. I assume we're talking about in the days of yesteryear.
Yeah, so that's the unfortunate thing. Compared to yesteryear, we have to be better, basically, because it has now made such a choice. Although, I mean, even if you go back to Greece and Rome and particularly those periods, I'm sure there are other periods as well. I think the Indian subcontinent struggled with this for a while, where they may not have had modern contraceptives, but they certainly made do with what they had. And so I think it is probably possible to overestimate the extent to which it is just a random byproduct in the past of doing what they're going to do anyway. Because there are, I guess you could say that there are other ways of getting around it, in the sense of, okay, if you know that if you really don't want children, and you know that having sex is going to result in having children, then you're going to not have sex. And, maybe you put your time into other things instead, like maybe you become an ascetic, or, I don't know.
Sorry, just that leap in progression there, Rupert. Going from celibacy to straight up asceticism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was a big thing in the later Roman Empire. But anyway, to get back on track.
I mean, I was going to say the Romans had a solution to having sex and not getting anyone pregnant.
Oh,
Is
God.
this going to be degenerate?
It's hyper degenerate. We already know that.
Come on, Kurtz, what is it?
Oh no, I'm not saying anything. I'm keeping things nice and vague, like you and your starve out all the idiots thing.
Wow.
Wow, Kurtz, wow. We edited this one out.
We were all thinking it.
Well, I think the point is that now that it is more of a choice, you need to simulate that you're starving the idiots by stopping the idiots from breeding. I mean,
You're just jumping straight to strangulation.
No, I don't. I don't actually want that because, well, okay. Apart from anything else, okay. Let me give a counter argument to some of my own positions then, because there are certainly downsides to being. So how we would conventionally measure this is, being higher on the IQ range. But there are a lot of downsides with being higher on the IQ range, such as increased rate of mental illness, and itself having fewer children. Although that may be a social phenomenon that is correlated with intelligence due to increased susceptibility to social phenomenon. I don't know.
Well, there's also the reduced genetic diversity, would make you more susceptible to disease.
Yes. So there are certainly advantages to having a healthy distribution on that metric in particular. But let's say you could take the top 20% of people in every conceivable. Okay, no. I'm gonna walk it back. Everyone should have children after all.
Huzzah.
But if we do it via aristocracy, which is okay, no, I'll fully voice the idea, and then I'll probably give some of my counter thoughts on it that I'm just having. I'm talking all this out as I'm thinking it. So if you have the aristocracy able to have more children and sustain more children, obviously because they've got more material means, then you're taking something of a tacit or like an implicit understanding of what makes a competent person or a capable person, and then you expand that. You expand the quantity of people with those qualities. Ideally. Hopefully. But if you combine that with my previous assertion that we should return to some kind of more hereditary model, then you are potentially not necessarily selecting for any quality in particular, other than perhaps this kind of pro-social perspective and care of other people in combination with whatever else they're doing. So you have to have a certain base level of competence in order to maintain your position in the aristocracy. But other than that, the only thing which I've set out, at least, maybe this is something that could just be more fully formed in future. But the only other thing that I've mentioned that puts you in the aristocracy is to be pro-social, to the extent that you're willing to make personal sacrifices in order to help the other people. But that means that you're not necessarily selecting for let's say in a Pareto distribution kind of sense, that you're not necessarily encouraging the top 20% of your population in terms of capabilities to reproduce, because a good number of those people would just happen to be in the non-aristocratic category. Did you follow all of that?
No.
I didn't.
I'm going to say I did, because you're going to have to go over it again anyway.
Okay, basically, because the aristocracy that I was talking about, or the way that I've set out aristocracy as being ideally more hereditary than it is in order to encourage more pro-social activities, that doesn't necessarily mean that by encouraging more, like the growth of that, essentially, to encompass more of the population, you're not necessarily going to be increasing the quality of the population by doing that, because you're not necessarily just selecting for, in terms of the people who are going to be able to breed more, you're not selecting for the people who are more capable necessarily. They would have to be, to some extent, more capable than your average Joe, but they wouldn't. It's not like a perfect selection mechanism, and I think I'm happy with that. I think I'm fine with that, as long as the thing that you're selecting for is pro-social. Yeah, is to be pro-social. Because, like I said, you do want something of a cross section of society in order to maximize your access to some of those traits, which may not necessarily be best represented at all strata. Was that a better explanation?
Yeah, I got it that time.
Okay, cool.
Do we have any more thoughts on this, or shall we move on to something else?
We can pick it up another time while we've had some time to think.
Yeah.
I still have my initial question of the, lowering the barrier to entry to politics, but we could do that next time.
We could. I think we're perpetually going to be able to chain these, because I think we could probably go more into aristocracy, because I think even if it's just for my own benefit of being able to hash out those thoughts a little bit more, it'd be interesting to think about how we should order and perhaps even select the aristocracy.
Why don't you let us know which one we should do next time in the comments below? Don't forget to click that subscribe button, ding your bell.
I'm more interested in participating in this podcast.
Okay. See you all next time then, I guess.
Yes.
Farewell.
Goodbye, everybody.